After reading Tennessee Williams' iconic play, A Streetcar Named Desire, I keep wondering, does Stanley, Stella, and Mitch end up living happily ever after? What do you think, Spy? Hi, my name is Moana, and this is my reading buddy Spike. And I am a reading and writing lover who disliked English class as both a student and a teacher, and I am now documenting my journey of rediscovering my love for words. I first read Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire in high school and started off this year rereading it to see if the experience would be different as an adult versus as a teenager. In my last video, I analyzed the story and shared my thoughts on it, so if you are interested, you might want to watch that video first before continuing on with this one. I'll leave a link to it in the description below so you can find it easily. So if you have read it already, you know that some pretty bad things happened at the end of the story, and three characters in particular, Stanley, Stella, and Mitch, did a few unsavory things in order to protect themselves. Since I finished reading the play, I keep wondering, what happens after the written story ends? Do those three characters end up finding happiness? Tennessee Williams never wrote a sequel to the story, and a lot of times when it comes to famous classic novels, other people will write their own sequels, so I was hoping to find something like that, but I don't think there are any in existence as far as I can find. A few days ago, I just so happened to be at a local public library when I saw this book on display, Killer ChatGPT Prompts by Guy Hart Davis. In this book, there is one entire section titled ChatGPT Prompts for Creative Writing and Fiction Writing. One part of the section explains how to ask ChatGPT to create an entire plot for you. So I know that using AI is a very controversial subject right now, and there are a lot of people out there who would say that it shouldn't exist because it's not ethical and it's killing creativity. But my big disclaimer here right now is that I'm not trying to publish an actual book or anything. And just for fun, I thought that maybe I can ask AI to write a continuation of A Streetcar Named Desire to help me understand what happens to Stanley, Stella, and Mitch after the actual written play that Tennessee Williams wrote is over. For my little experiment here, I input the same prompt into 3 different AI platforms. I just finished reading Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, and I keep wondering if Stanley, Stella, and Mitch end up happy afterwards. Please write a continuation of the story to show whether or not they live happily after everything that happened in the story. Well, the results were really interesting, and one seemed so ridiculous that Tennessee Williams would be turning in his grave right now if he could hear it. Honestly, I didn't really expect much out of these AI platforms because I expect that writing a story or even a continuation of an existing piece of literature would require the kind of creativity that could only exist in the human brain and heart. So, we're going to take these 3 stories with a grain of salt and just enjoy them as entertainment. The original story was written in a play format, and maybe if I had been more specific, I might have been able to get AI to generate them as a play script as well. They actually ended up giving me the story continuations in a standard narrative form, which is fine since again, I'm just doing this for fun. So let's get into the first story. A year later in New Orleans. The humid air hung heavy as Stanley Kowalski returned home from the factory, his shirt clinging to his chest. Inside the cramped apartment, Stella rocked her baby boy, whose cries had become a near constant background noise. She looked up as Stanley entered, her expression a mixture of wariness and forced cheerfulness. "Hey, baby," Stanley said, bending to kiss her. His affection was rough, and Stella flinched, though she tried to hide it. "How was work?" she asked, shifting the baby to her other arm. "Same as always. How's the kid?" "Fussy." Stanley glanced at the table where a modest dinner waited. "Smells good," he said, sitting down without offering to help. Stella's shoulders sagged, but she said nothing. Though outwardly their life seemed stable, the cracks were widening. Stella couldn't forget the events of the past year, the chaos Blanche had brought, the way it ended, and the guilt gnawing at her for sending her sister away. She avoided thinking too deeply about Stanley's role in it all because to do so might mean confronting truths she wasn't ready to face. Mitch's lonely days. Across town, Mitch sat alone in his small apartment, nursing a glass of bourbon. The clock ticked loudly, the sound echoing in the emptiness of his life. He hadn't seen much of Stanley or Stella since Blanche left. The betrayal he felt toward Stanley for the way he treated Blanche, and toward himself for being too weak to stand up for her, had driven a wedge between him and his old friends. He pulled out the tattered paper lantern Blanche had once placed over the light bulb in Stella's home. He'd taken it with him that last day, a keepsake he didn't understand but couldn't part with. "What kind of man am I?" he muttered to himself, tipping the glass to his lips. He thought of Blanche often, wondering if she was truly insane or if the world had simply been too cruel to her. Either way, the guilt weighed on him. The years ahead. For Stanley and Stella, life became a series of compromises. Stanley continued his domineering ways, and Stella retreated further into silence. She adored her child, but couldn't shake the feeling that she was living a lie. Sometimes, she dreamed of packing a bag and leaving, but the thought of raising her son alone terrified her more than the thought of staying. Mitch, meanwhile, became a shadow of the man he once was. He visited bars, struck up meaningless conversations, and occasionally thought about finding a way to apologize to Blanche, though he didn't know if it would make a difference. As for Blanche, she remained in the mental institution, her fragile psyche unable to withstand the trauma she had endured. Occasionally, she wrote letters to Stella, but they were never sent. Happiness for these characters was as elusive as the streetcar that had once carried Blanche to Elysian fields. Their lives continued, shaped by the decisions they made and the ghosts they carried, but true peace remained just out of reach. So this wasn't too bad. It did address my question about whether or not everyone is happy in regards to Stella and Mitch. It didn't tell me much about Stanley though. Or maybe it's lack of explanation about Stanley that does say a lot in that he never changes and he just continues to be the brute that he always was. It feels like this could be a realistic epilogue to the story if Tennessee Williams had decided to write one. We can see that life does go on, but their actions do eat away at Stella and Mitch, and their lives are truly changed forever because of them. They don't forget about what happened, and they don't ever completely move on themselves. To me, that's a very realistic picture of how life would have continued for those characters. Let's move on to the next AI platform story. After the harrowing events that unfolded in the Kowalski household, the air is thick with tension. Blanche has been taken away to a mental institution, leaving Stanley, Stella, and Mitch to grapple with the aftermath of their choices. In the weeks following Blanche's departure, Stanley felt a mix of relief and guilt. He had always been the dominant figure, but the confrontation with Blanche had shed light on the fragility of his world. Stella found herself torn between her loyalty to her sister and her love for Stanley. As they sat together one evening, the weight of silence hung over them. "Stanley," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think we could have handled things differently?" Stanley, looking at the floor, murmured, "Maybe, but it was survival, Stella. I had to protect what was mine." Stella nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. But at what cost? In the following months, they decided to seek counseling, attending sessions together to address their issues. It was a long journey, but they began rebuilding their relationship, focusing on their love and their son, Billy. Eventually, they found a balance, learning to communicate openly and support each other, which fostered a deeper bond. On weekends, they would take long walks in the park, sharing dreams for a brighter future. Their love, though scarred, began to heal. Mitch, devastated by the revelations about Blanche, found himself questioning the nature of love and trust. He often visited the local bar, drowning his sorrows in dark thoughts. However, one night he met Claire, a kind-hearted woman who reminded him of the hope he had almost lost. Claire was gentle, patient, and willing to listen. As they spent more time together, Mitch began to open up about his past, including the pain surrounding Blanche. With Claire's support, Mitch found strength to move on. He learned to appreciate love without the shadows of betrayal, and slowly, his heart began to heal. By the end of the year, Mitch and Claire decided to start a new chapter together, filled with laughter and warmth, finding happiness in each other. Oh my gosh, what? Okay, this is the one that made me laugh the most because seriously, Stanley and Stella seek counseling together and learn to communicate openly and support each other while Mitch moves on, finding happiness with another woman. I feel like this was the most wholesome and sugary sweet continuation that could have been generated, and it's almost like AI got the idea off of a Hallmark movie or something. I don't even feel like arguing against this because it's ridiculous, and I feel like I don't even have to explain why, since I'm sure that you can clearly see it too. First of all, I could be wrong, since I've never actually looked this up, but I doubt that there was such a thing as easily accessible couples counseling in 1951. Second, I find it really difficult to believe that someone like Stanley Kowalski would actually go to couples counseling and become a supportive and communicative partner. If he actually did go to couples counseling, did he tell the counselor what he did to Blanche? I really doubt that. Finally, even though Mitch wasn't a bad guy, it's hard to think that he just finds love and happiness in another woman who is able to magically heal his heart and soul. Maybe my skepticism with Mitch is just me being jaded, but honestly, it just sounds too perfect for me to believe. One thing I can appreciate about this AI story continuation is that it made me laugh a lot and I found it entertaining, so I hope you did as well. Finally, the last one. New Orleans 6 months later. Night after night, Stella lies awake in the dark, listening to Stanley's breathing beside her. Sleep comes harder now. The sounds from the street below, the rattling streetcars, the jazz from the four dunes, the shouts of drunken revelers, no longer drown out the voice in her head, the one that whispers, "What have you done?" She sees Blanche in her dreams, not the Blanche they took away, but the sister who taught her poetry when they were girls at Belle Reve, who brushed her hair and told her stories of gallant suitors. In the dreams, Blanche just looks at her, silent and accusing, until Stella wakes with tears on her face. Stanley has his own dreams, though he'd never admit it. He wakes sometimes, sweating, with the echo of breaking glass in his ears. But in the morning, he pushes it down, armors himself in the same certainty that has always protected him. He did what he had to do. Blanche was the intruder, the threat to his home, his marriage, his way of life. If anyone asks, though they never do, he'd say she got what was coming to her. But lately, there are moments when that certainty cracks, when he catches Stella looking at him with something like fear in her eyes, when he holds his son and suddenly remembers Blanche's face as they led her away. These thoughts are dangerous. They threaten the foundation of who Stanley believes himself to be. So he drowns them in whiskey, in poker games, in the familiar comfort of his own rage. The baby is Stella's anchor. She pours herself into motherhood with desperate intensity, as if by loving him enough, she can wash away her guilt. But sometimes when he cries, she catches herself wondering what she'll tell him about his aunt when he's older. What story can possibly explain what they did to her? Stanley watches his wife with their child and feels something unfamiliar stirring. Not remorse exactly, but a vague unease. He sees how she shields the baby when his voice rises, how she's always ready to sweep the child up and retreat to Eunice's apartment upstairs. He tells himself it's her problem, her weakness. But in unguarded moments, he remembers Blanche's accusations about what kind of man he is, and for the first time in his life, Stanley Kowalski feels the need to prove something to himself. Their neighbors have developed a particular way of not talking about it. Eunice still brings food, still watches the baby, but there's something careful in her manner now. She sees the bruises Stella has stopped trying to hide, notices how Stella flinches at sudden movements, but she says nothing. After all, didn't she tell Stella herself that life has to go on? Stanley tries in his way. He brings home extra money, talks about moving somewhere better. He's drinking less, coming home earlier. But his attempts at gentleness have a desperate edge, like a wild animal trying to be tamed. The violence still simmers beneath the surface. They both know it's only a matter of time. Because Stanley may feel uneasy about what happened to Blanche, may even have moments of doubt, but he hasn't changed. He can't change, because to truly face what he did would shatter the image of himself he's built his life around. One evening, as Stella rocks the baby, she realizes with sudden clarity that she's becoming what Blanche feared most. Someone who clings to illusions because she can't bear the truth. She's built her life on a foundation of lies, that Stanley's love is worth the price she pays, that she had no choice, that what happened to Blanche was necessary. Each lie is a brick in the wall she's built to keep reality at bay. They survive, yes, but survival isn't happiness. Stella lives in a prison of her own making, where the bars are forged from desire, dependency, and denial. She stays because she's convinced herself she has nowhere else to go, because the alternative is to face what she's done, what she's become. And Stanley? He lives in his own prison, one built of masculine pride and violence, where remorse is just another form of weakness to be conquered, where facing the truth about himself is more terrifying than any external threat. Some nights, standing on the balcony where she once called Stanley's name with such longing, she looks up at the moths circling the street lamp. They beat their wings against the light until they burn, unable to break free from what destroys them. Stella understands them now better than she'd like to. Mitch doesn't come around anymore. The other poker players still do. Steve, Pablo, the rest. But Mitch's chair stays empty. He tried at first to continue as if nothing had changed, but the memories of Blanche haunt every game. Her delicate paper lantern still hanging where she'd put it, the echo of her refined voice calling him her beau, the way she looked at him that last night, desperate and afraid. Sometimes Mitch drinks alone at the Four Dunes, and in his cups, the truth he's tried to bury surfaces. He failed her. Not just at the end, when he abandoned her to Stanley's mercy, but from the beginning. He'd wanted a lady, pure and refined, and when he discovered Blanche was human, desperate, flawed, seeking love in all the wrong places, he'd punished her for failing to fulfill his fantasy. Now, in his darker moments, he understands that he's no better than Stanley. His cruelty was just quieter, wrapped in disappointment instead of violence. The weight of it changes him. He stops dating entirely, moves his mother to a better apartment closer to the hospital, throws himself into caring for her. Some say he's become a better son, more attentive, more gentle. But those who know him well see how he flinches when anyone mentions Blanche's name, how he can't look Stella in the eye anymore, how his hands shake slightly when he passes the Kowalski's apartment on his way to work. Behind her through the window, Stella can see Stanley with the baby, trying to be gentle, trying to be the kind of father he thinks he should be. But his hands, the ones that destroyed her sister, that strike out in rage, that pull Stella back to him again and again, those hands can never truly learn tenderness. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy. Not that Stanley feels no remorse, but that even if he did, it wouldn't be enough to change what he is. The only one who carries real guilt is Mitch, and his guilt, like Stella's, comes too late to save Blanche. Well, I think out of all of the AI-generated stories, this was the most realistic and developed one, and this was the closest to what I was looking for. We can see that Stanley, Stella, and Mitch are all still the same people that they were before Blanche entered the picture. Stanley is domineering and violent. Stella still depends on him and tries to ignore all of the ways that he hurts her, and Mitch is still lonely. In this end, they're all the same people, but now they're haunted by the events that took place after Blanche entered their lives. They don't just make peace with themselves and move on. They just kind of learn to live with their own negative thoughts and feelings. You know how sometimes when a book is made into a movie and the movie producers will change or add things to the story? I feel like I could imagine somebody adding this ending to a movie production of A Streetcar Named Desire, since it does seem so plausible. So, what do you think? After hearing these 3 AI-generated continuations of A Streetcar Named Desire, did you have any thoughts? Did you agree or disagree with my opinions of them? Let me know in the comments. I had a lot of fun and actually laughed a lot with this little experiment of seeing how AI would continue the story, so I hope that you enjoyed it too. Thank you so much for joining me for this video, and if you enjoyed it, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to see more of my book reviews and other bookish content. Until next time, happy reading and see you soon!